Hi everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie. Today I'm going to do a bookshelf tour. So the purpose of this video is actually to show you what the extent of the problem is, so to speak. I have behind me my main bookshelf in this apartment. There are a number of smaller stacks in the other room, but this is probably most of my books that are behind me. And how I want to structure these videos is that I will spend the rest of this video giving you an overview of the bookshelf and how I arrange things. And then I'll go into a little bit of detail about one particular section of my bookshelf at a time over the next few videos. So today I will start with the bookshelf overview and then we'll have a look at the Penguin Classics line, because I feel like that's the part of the bookshelf that everyone can identify with, because I think everyone has a few Penguin Classics on their bookshelf. So a little bit about my bookshelf and the collection. Most of my books are classics, contemporary literary fiction, and some non-fiction. That is quite a limiting category of books, and I hope to expand in the future, but only after I've read through enough of my unread books. Most of my books are, as I said, on the shelf behind me, and they are arranged, I don't know if you can tell just from looking at it, they're arranged by edition, and they're arranged sometimes by color. I know that some people would be appalled by that system of arrangement, but I am quite a visual person and I don't have that many books. So I don't have any problems finding books arranging it this way, but it also gives me a lot of pleasure every time I look at my bookshelf in terms of the overall aesthetic of it. So, and that is important. Because the bookshelf is not just a utilitarian object. Books are not just utilitarian, but they are also decorative. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but they are decorative, and this is the way that I'm arranging it at the moment. If I'm in a position to expand my bookshelf at some point in the future, I may need to think about a more logical way of arranging things. But at the moment, with these many books, I don't really need to. So this is the bookshelf. You can see that it fits this nook perfectly. And I have most of my books on this shelf and a number of little knickknacks. At the top of the shelf, I have what I call the brown or mauve collection, and a little bit of my hardback classics, my old camera, these little cows I got from Peru, they're really cute. And on this side I have a big pile of books in larger format that I really like. And then coming down below, we've got some of my Penguin Modern Classics in the different silver and aqua coloured spines. And across here we have my trusty Pentax film camera and the Penguin Classics line. And here we have some of my favourite editions of classics, which is the Reader's Digest editions. I'll talk about them maybe in a future video. On the third level down, we have the blue books. So most of these are the Wordsworth editions, which I bought when Borders closed down for pittance. And I also have this collected works of Oscar Wilde, which has all of his novels, plays, and De Profundis, and some of these fairy tales as well. So I love this volume and I read it a lot. Over here we have the Russian classics and also the black books. And here we venture into red. So a lot of these are the old vintage red spines, but also a couple of others as well. Fourth shelf down, we have my Harry Potter books. Most of these are actually the edition that I originally read them in. So the final three would definitely be first editions, and I think these were some kind of commemorative editions when they first came out. I still really enjoy them. I sometimes still pick one up and read one.
but otherwise they're there as a reminder of where it all started, because Harry Potter was the series that introduced me to reading and really made it a lifelong hobby of mine. So over here we have the cream coloured or white books. So these two are Chinese books, which I'll talk about one day in a different video. This is Kate Atkinson's Life After Life. I had mixed feelings about this one, which is why I've kept it. I think it's due for a reread. Here we've got all of the cream coloured books. Some of them I've read, some of them I haven't. And again, I'll go through them in a bit more detail in a future video. My pride and joy, the Anne of Green Gables books. These were my absolute favourites when I was a girl, and I read them in this particular edition, which I've since collected methodically over the years, and I'm still on the lookout for a couple that I'm missing, but I absolutely adore these books. They are delightful, and again, as with Harry Potter, I sometimes still pick up a copy and I read through them again just as a balm for my soul. White Tiger is also a really good book. I really love this one. And the last shelf on the floor is the larger format books. Mostly they remain unread, so I can't really tell you how I feel about them. And they are unfortunately a little bit tucked out of sight, even though now that I look at them, a lot of them are books that I really wanted to read at one point. So as part of this project, I'll be going through them one by one and knocking a few of these off my unread shelf as well. All right, I've gotten all the books from Penguin off my shelf, so let's start. Now, these are these little small orange and cream pocket-sized penguin books. I think they're called popular penguins, and they seem to be a real thing in Australia that I don't see much of in other countries. I have a few of these and I love them. Whenever I can get an edition in this edition, I tend to get them because for a really superficial reason, they fit perfectly inside several of my coat pockets. And so in winter, I love to wear a coat, slip this one in my pocket, slip my wallet, phone and keys in the other one, and off I go. I don't even need a bag. So I love these, and I have quite a few of them. So I've got The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I've never read The Great Gatsby. I know. The reason why is that when I was growing up, when I was going through school, the year levels above and below me read this one for school, and for some reason we never did. So even though I didn't have the experience of having this book ruined for me because of having to study it in high school, I've always associated it with high school curriculum, and I've just never gone to it. But I have the book and I plan on reading it as part of that project. The next one I have is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is one of my favorite books. I absolutely adore this book. It's been a while since I've last read it, so it's due for a reread. But this is the book that got me started and got me really into South American literature, into magical realism, and this kind of multi-generational epic that mimics the fate of a nation. I absolutely love this format, and this is one of my favorite books of all time. Breakfast at Tiffany's. This is another good one. I have never read In Cold Blood, but if Truman Capote is as good in that as he is in this, it's an absolute winner. Next we have Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World by Niall Ferguson. I have not read this one. I don't really know why I bought it, and this was very, very close to being unhauled at some stage. But I think I would like to know what Niall Ferguson thinks about the British Empire. I know what I think, but it's not often the case that we need to read books by someone who we agree with entirely. So I do want to see a different perspective, and I don't pretend that I know everything about British colonial history. So it would be interesting to read. That's why I'm keeping it. Next, we have The History of Sexuality, Volume 1 by Michel Foucault. I bought this when I was at university and I was reading a lot of Foucault for my degree. I've never actually read the entire thing from start to finish. And so I'm thinking about reading it, although over the years my views on kind of postmodernism, deconstruction has really changed. So it is part of the 90 books that I would like to read through this channel, and I think I would like to remain open to the possibility that I still find this compelling or convincing, but I do come at it with a degree of skepticism that I didn't have when I first bought the book. I only have a few books in the old Penguin formats, which is this black spine with a coloured tab on top and a cream border. And also a cream back. So some of these, well actually all of them I bought in a secondhand shop, and these particular ones I think I picked up one day when someone with a real passion for French literature had donated a whole bunch of books, because I picked up quite a few of my French books on the same day from the same op shop or charity shop, as anyone outside of Australia would call it. So this is Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris. I've not read it. It's looking like it will be the first Victor Hugo book I read, because the other one that I own is Les Miserables, and that's much more of a daunting read. So looking forward to this one. The next one is A Harlot High and Low by Balzac. Again, haven't read this, part of the same haul of French literature that I got on the same day from a mysterious donor to the local charity shop. The cover is fabulous, look at it. Such a beautiful painting, love it. And the third one I have in that format is Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest in Other Plays. I have actually read this one. In fact, this is my high school copy. So we studied The Importance of Being Earnest at school, and then I read the rest of them. Lady Windermere's Fan. Actually, I haven't read Salome, and I've read An Ideal Husband. So most of these I have read since high school. And now we have the Penguin Black Spines. I think this is the edition that people are most familiar with. I have a few of them, and actually most of them are unread. Reading classics is something that is relatively new to my reading habit. I only probably started doing it since the pandemic. For whatever reason, I read mostly contemporary fiction before the pandemic. And when the pandemic started, it's like someone turned down the dial on noise around the world, and I found myself craving more complex sentences, craving certain types of writing that is more easily satisfied when you're reading classics. So most of my Penguin Black Spine classics were purchased in the last 18 months, I would say. So a lot of these are unread. The first one though is read, and that's Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Tales of Terror. I loved this book. I'd always assumed, because the notion or the concept of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was so well known, that there was no need to read this book. How wrong was I? Because it's absolutely fantastic. The setup, the structure of the story, the writing, the way that he reveals kind of a little bit of what was going on and what was wrong at a time, and then you get the final reveal at the end. It's absolutely wonderful. And actually the other tales of terror from memory were quite good as well. Robert Louis Stevenson has been an absolute revelation to me this year, and I can't wait to read more books by him. Next we have The Princess Casamassima by Henry James. I've not read this. I picked this up at the local Little Free Library, which is just down the street from me. Someone had put it in there and had read it by the looks of things. Henry James scares me. I find him incredibly dense and very, very difficult to read. And so as a result of it, I haven't read it. I'm looking forward to getting to know Henry James a bit more and seeing whether or not I actually like him. Next up, we have a book that I have read, which is The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain. I loved this book, or at least the first half of it, and I have a very difficult and complex relationship with the second half of it. So for those who don't know, Mark Twain, this book is about, it's effectively Mark Twain's travel journal on a trip that he takes around the Mediterranean, ending up in Palestine. The first half of the book shows him, gallivanting around Europe, in Paris, in Milan, in Venice. And I was reading this book as I was traveling last month through Venice and Milan and Paris, and it was wonderful to be able to read what Mark Twain thought about all of these places that many years ago, and especially when a lot of the sites that he was seeing still exist today. For example, the Duomo in Milan is still the same today as it was when Mark Twain was there. So it was an absolutely wonderful read for the first half. And then in the second half, Mark Twain gets into, I suppose, the Muslim world. So he goes to Turkey, and then from Turkey he goes through Syria and eventually ends up in Palestine. That's where it started becoming increasingly difficult to read, because Mark Twain has had a number of prejudices against people in those countries. There's frequent references to, Syrian people being dirty, Turkish people being savage, uncivilized, and they're really, really difficult to read with a modern sensibility. And I totally understand that our acceptance of language like that has drastically changed since the days of Mark Twain, but there is also a part of me that thinks Mark Twain could do better and should do better. As I said before, I don't need an author to agree with me entirely politically, or to have the same values as me to enjoy the book. And I really, really did enjoy this book. Mark Twain has an absolutely wonderful narrative voice. He is funny. He's a friendly voice in your ear, and he has this wonderful self-deprecating sense of humor that runs throughout the entire book. You really get a good sketch of what he was as a person through reading this, and I do recommend this book. Just go into it being prepared that you will find some of his values challenging towards the second half of the book. Next one is Michel de Montaigne, The Complete Essays. This one intimidates me. I've actually wrapped it in a clear film to protect the book, because I don't think it would survive a very long reading, and this is going to take time. I have read some of Montaigne's essays in isolation, but I've never read the whole thing from start to finish, and it is a goal of mine to do so. So a while ago, my local bookshop had a 3-for-2 Penguin classic sale. So I went into the 3-for-2 sale with a strategy that I was going to find 3 books that were slightly more expensive for the Penguin range, but also harder to find for the Penguin range. And so with that, I got, the first book I got was Michel de Montaigne's essays, and I still haven't read it. I'm working myself up to reading it at some point. Next, we have The Bostonians by Henry James. Again, this is one of those things where Henry James intimidates me, and I find him incredibly dense. I've been told this is one of his better novels, particularly I think there's a real divide between the early Henry James works and the later Henry James works, when he started dictating everything. And I think this is one of maybe the early ones, I don't know. So I'm hoping to get around to it one day, but I think I will need to work myself up to it. Next, we have George Eliot's Middlemarch. This is the old cover, which I much prefer to the new one. I think the new one, they've changed this to the block letters on the side, which I'm not a huge fan of. I'm hoping to read this in January. So watch this space. I have a feeling I'm going to get along with George Eliot, but I think a lot of people get along with George Eliot, so maybe that's not a wild guess on my part, but I'm really looking forward to reading this. Next, we have Charles Dickens' Bleak House. Charles Dickens is another writer I have slight difficulties with, not because he's a difficult writer to read, but rather I don't love his narrative voice, which means that every time I start reading him, inevitably I get a bit annoyed and I stop reading. So I'm hoping, because Bleak House is kind of about a case, certainly the blurb mentions the courts of chancery, which are the old courts in equity in the UK. So I'm hoping with the legal drama part of it, I will eventually get into this book. But so far, it's remained unread on my bookshelf. Next, we have Jane Eyre. Now, Jane Eyre is not my favourite Bronte book. My favourite Bronte book so far, and I've not read Tenant of Wildfell Hall yet, but so far my favourite Bronte book is Wuthering Heights, with all its crazy, weird, howling energy that it has. But Jane Eyre is a good one, so I do like it. So I haven't read it for now probably over a decade, so it's due for a reread. Next we have Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. This is one of the two Austens which I haven't yet read. I haven't read Persuasion and I haven't read Mansfield Park. So I'm very happy to have this on my bookshelf because it is pretty high up on the list of books to read next. I mentioned before that my local bookshop had a 3 for 2 sale. So, and I got the Michel de Montaigne. This is the other book that I got as part of that 3 for 2 book sale, and that is Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. This translation is by Christine Donegal, and I haven't read it. I'm working myself up to reading it, but it's just so big, and I heard there's lots and lots of digressions, and I really hate digressions. So we'll see how we go with this one. And finally, we have the third book that I got as part of the 3 for 2 Penguin Classics deal at my local bookshop. And that's Catherine Mansfield's Collected Stories. For some reason, no one talks about Catherine Mansfield. I picked this up because I've never heard of a New Zealand writer before, and I've never read a New Zealand writer. And she, well, she was certainly born in New Zealand. I think she's buried at Fontainebleau, just outside Paris. And I've never read anything by her. I was a bit confused because I understood her to be a contemporary of Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf in the Penguin line is in the modern line, whereas Catherine Mansfield is in the Black Spine. I don't understand the logic. I haven't read this yet. I'm looking forward to reading this because I love short stories and I've heard really good things about Catherine Mansfield's writing. Next, we have the Penguin Moderns. Now, the Penguin Moderns confuse me because they come in a whole array. Actually, I missed one. They come in a whole array of different colours, and it seems like Penguin keeps changing its mind about what colour the spines should be. So you get a whole range of aqua, silver, and white. I don't have as many of them, but the ones I have read have all been quite good. So the first one I have is Albert Camus' The Outsider, or I think it's translated also as A Stranger now. This one I didn't love. I am confused by Camus because it seems that he has a real following of people who absolutely adore him and adore his writing, but it leaves me quite cold. And I'm not sure why. I am keeping an open mind. I have this book also in French and I'm hoping to read it at some point in the next year. So watch this space. I might change my mind about Camus, but so far I'm fairly indifferent. Next we have Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. I loved Breakfast at Tiffany's and some of Capote's short stories. So I'm actually really looking forward to reading this one. I heard that it's sort of his major work and a real work of literary non-fiction. So looking forward to this one. Hopefully I'll be reading this fairly soon because it's quite high up on my to-be-read list. Next we have an author that doesn't get talked about very often, but look at her. She's amazing. This is Colette and the Collected Short Stories of Colette. I recently just read Chérie by Colette, and I was absolutely amazed that here was this French writer who was a contemporary of Proust, was a contemporary of Virginia Woolf, who is revered in France. And yet in the English-speaking world, we very rarely talk about her. She's not widely seen in print. I think Vintage now publishes quite a few of her books in print, but she's not really discussed or talked about as a French writer. And I was shocked by how good Sherry is as a book. So having read Sherry, I'm really looking forward to reading her collected short stories. I'm also looking forward to reading some of the Claudine books once I get through all of my unread books on my shelf. Next, we have one of the Silver Spine Penguin Moderns, which is André Gide's The Immoralist. I got the sense that André Gide is quite like Camus. They seem to have a fairly similar style of that kind of modern, not so absurd, but an apathetic vibe to them. And I think that is maybe very much a product of the First and Second World Wars. But I read this earlier on in the year, and again, it left me quite cold. Next we have Rainer Maria Rilke Selected Poems. I have read some of this, so I'm not sure if I counted it as an read or unread. It is technically an anthology, so potentially it's been listed in the read category, but I've actually read quite a few of it and I love Rilke. Next we have another one of the Silver Penguin Moderns, which is the Kafka's Metamorphoses and Other Short Stories. I have read Metamorphoses when I was, Metamorphosis, I should say, when I was younger. I don't remember much of it other than the fact that he turns into a cockroach. I haven't read the other stories in this collection, and it is listed as unread on my bookshelf, so I will be rereading Metamorphosis and reading for the first time some of the other stories in this volume very soon. This is a book that is read, and that's Mary McCarthy's Stones of Florence and Venice Observed. I read this right before I went to Venice, and it gave such a different perspective to my time there, and it really added a lot, particularly from an art history perspective, to my appreciation of all of the artworks and the frescoes and the divine paintings that you see just in odd little churches around Venice. I had an absolute blast, and I have this book to thank her for. And finally, we have Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. I'm a bit on the fence about this book. On the one hand, I read it through it basically in one sitting. There was a lot to the book, and there was a real sense of Orientalism that runs throughout this book that makes me somewhat question why a German writer was writing about essentially the story of an Indian Brahmin. But having said that, the book itself has a kind of universalist appeal to it, even if you, particularly if you see through all of the Orientalist kind of trappings of the story. I did enjoy it. And last but not least, we have a couple of these small Penguin Moderns. I only have 4 of them. They are rather addictive once you start buying them, because I think they're about $2 or $3 here in Australia. So every time I see them in a bookshop, I'm like, well, it's so cheap, it's so small, let's buy them. To be fair to me, I have read through all of them. So the first one we have George Orwell's Notes on Nationalism. And I absolutely love this. I wasn't a fan of Animal Farm, so I actually haven't read any of George Orwell's other novels. Having read Notes on Nationalism, I'm curious to read some of his non-fiction writing, because I think there's quite a few collected essays that Penguin publishes. So I'm hoping to get my hands on those once I get through my unread bookshelf. And I really enjoyed reading Orwell. I think he's absolutely phenomenal as an essayist, and yeah, looking forward to reading more from him. Martin Luther King Jr., I have Letters from Birmingham Jail. Weirdly, when I read through this, the thing that I thought about the most was Antigone, because Martin Luther King really goes into a lot of detail about his thoughts on whether or not we should follow immoral laws, and what protests should look like when the thing that we're protesting is the law. And that kind of goes through some of the themes that come up in the play Antigone as well. So I really thought a lot about Antigone. I actually went and read through some passages from Antigone while I was reading this. Next we have Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. I loved this. I think I flipped over the first essay in this collection is called Poetry is Not a Luxury. And it starts off, I'll just read the first sentence. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realized. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. How wonderful is that? I read through the first paragraph and I knew I would love it. I do love it. And again, it's one of those things where the little penguins give you a taster of what the writer is like. And if you're interested, you can go and buy the full volume. And I do absolutely intend to read more from Audre Lorde. And finally, we have Chinua Achebe, Africa's Tarnished Name. Again, this is one of those things. I read it, I loved it, and I hope to read more from Chinua Achebe. On the topic of little books, I have only 2 of these small black penguin little black classics. Again, these are kind of addictive to buy because again, they're $2, $3 at the local bookshop, and sometimes it's just tempting to pick one up as you're checking out the books. So I only have 2. One is one of my favorites. This is Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. So anyone who hasn't read it, Rilke just gives the most tender, insightful and empathetic advice to a young poet who's perhaps feeling insecure and unsure of himself. And this is an absolutely wonderful read that just feels like a hug. And I actually go back to this quite often. Next we have My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun by Emily Dickinson. I heard a couple of complaints about this particular volume because the punctuation marks apparently is a little bit different. I don't know why Emily Dickinson's fans keep going on about punctuation marks, because to be honest, I don't think her poetry changes that much by punctuation marks. I do like Emily Dickinson. I don't love her. I think that's really that's where I stand on this particular writer or poet. I have 3 of these penguin great ideas, and they're all from different series, so you can tell which series they're from by the color of the spine. So this is a mauve one, and then I've got a red one and a green one, and so they're all from different editions. The Penguin will release 10 of these at a time. The first one I have is Days of Reading by Marcel Proust. So this is part of my Proust reading year. So every year, since last year, I have a theme for the year. So last year, my theme for the year is Proust, where I read In Search of Lost Time. I read this. I read a couple of kind of Proust adjacent books as well. And then this year, the theme for the year is Russians. So I read a whole lot of Russian literature, which I will probably cover in a different video. But for present purposes, I read this last year. I didn't love it. And the problem, I think, isn't so much Proust, but rather that these were not essays that were intended to be published as a collected volume, however small that volume might be. They're sort of Proust's own literary criticism, effectively, and mostly of Ruskin, because Proust was quite a big fan of Ruskin. But I don't think they were ever meant to be published in this kind of form and without any context or background to them. The next one I did like, which is Michel de Montaigne on friendship. In fact, I liked it so much I went and bought the full set of Montaigne's essays. The essays on friendship are kind of his most famous ones. There is one thing that you have to be aware of with these essays, which is that he says some pretty horrible things about women. He didn't think much of them, and he
routinely says kind of quite misogynistic things. Of course, he was writing these, I think, in the 1400s, so we have to excuse at least some of the attitudes, but at the same time, they do read quite jarringly. And so quite often I'll get to something that he says, which, you know, about how dumb women are or something, and it takes me out of the essay for a while. And that's one thing that kind of ruined my experience of reading. But otherwise, overall, I found these to be a really insightful look into someone else's mind. And quite apart from the misogynism thing, I did really like Montaigne as a person. So I'm looking forward to reading the whole volume. And finally, I have another volume that I absolutely adore, which is Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I think I'll talk more about this in my year-end wrap-up video. I read it just this year and it was mind-blowingly good. Before Penguin went to their kind of larger black spine formats, for a period of time they published kind of these small orange spine paperbacks. And I only have 3 of them, and they happen to be part of my French book haul from the local charity shop. It drives me nuts a little bit, and you'll see why. So it's Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter by Simone de Beauvoir, The Prime of Life by Simone de Beauvoir, and the final volume, which is All Said and Done by Simone de Beauvoir. And 2 of these appear to be in the same edition, but the first one is not. The first one is a different cover, different edition, has a slightly lighter spine, but also a penguin, and it drives me nuts. I have not read these yet. In fact, I've never read anything by Simone de Beauvoir. I am a little bit intimidated by these books because I haven't had the best experience with French existentialism. So we'll see how we go with these. But as I recall, they were about 50 cents each. So obviously I got the full set. Last but not least, we have some odd volumes of Penguin classics, which doesn't really fit in with the rest of the gang. First, I have some of these, I think they're called pocket penguins, and they've got the penguin logo at the front, and they were published in these different colors to indicate which language they were translated from. So obviously green, I think, is Chinese, and this is Aileen Chang's Lust Caution. Aileen Chang is a writer with an absolute cult following in China. She's not talked about that much in the West, which is a shame because she is, if you think about the population of China and Chinese speaking peoples around the world, she's got to be one of the most popular writers in the world. And this is a small collection of her short stories. I've since actually gone and bought her short stories in original Chinese to read because I loved these so much. But just know that reading them in English will not and does not affect your enjoyment of Aileen Chang. She translates very well into English, and she is this kind of cold, cruel, hurt woman who's writing in against a political backdrop of absolute war and turmoil. And these stories are incredibly tender and sad and absolutely wonderful to read. Next we have Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. This is in the Penguin Classics but for children. So I think Penguin published a series of these all in different colours. So I only have the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn because some of them, and you do need to be careful, some of them are actually abridged. So this is unabridged, and it will say whether or not it's unabridged at the back. I remember reading Huckleberry Finn as a child in Chinese. Even in Chinese, Mark Twain is very, very funny. So I'm looking forward to reading this one to see whether or not the humour holds up as I'm a bit older now. And finally, we have this very special edition. I've never seen this before. It's a Penguin classic, but it's a red spine. And it's a red spine because it's part of the Product Red range where the profits go to fighting AIDS in Africa. So apparently Penguin published a few of these. And this is Edith Wharton's House of Mirth. So one of my favourite books is The Age of Innocence. And for some reason, even though I love The Age of Innocence, I've never gone on to read more from Edith Wharton. So this is pretty high up on my list, as in I think I will read it in December if I get around to it. I love Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, and I cannot wait to see whether her writing holds up in her other novels. And I think that's it. That's all of my Penguin classics. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please subscribe or leave a comment below so I know you're there, and I'll see you next time.